The Covenant of the Enlightened. The architects of the dystopian age, the Covenant of the Enlightened, wield their formidable intellect to sweep aside those who stand in the way of science and progress. These masters of technology covet knowledge above all things and believe that it's only they who can steer humanity on a path to enlightenment. Whether with monstrous fusions of man and machine, or with their terrifying and wondrous war engines, the Covenant of the Enlightened take every opportunity to demonstrate their technological supremacy. The discoveries that were intended to herald a new era for humanity are instead used to punish those who would misuse them. Only when the Covenant are lauded as the rightful leaders of the earth, this new dystopian age, can the world be brought into a new dawn of achievement and prosperity. Assessment by Service Agent Kingston, for a director's eyes only. Director Lincoln: it is human nature for like-minded individuals to seek each other out, to form deep and lasting bonds, and to establish communities and societies in a world that often seems bent on keeping each person isolated and alone. As you may already be aware, one of the oldest such societies in Europe is La Société des Amis du Nouvel Éclaircissement, founded in Vienna in the early 16th century. The Amis, as they called themselves, were scientists, philosophers, and free thinkers who enjoyed an active, lively correspondence, sharing their desires, dreams, and scientific exploits through written letters and occasional symposia. Ahead of their time. Generally, to be invited into the Amis, a man or woman must have proven themselves through extraordinary accomplishments with extensive peer-reviewed research or intellectual treatises. As such, most members were relatively advanced in years and rather set in their ways. By the early 19th century, most of humanity's greatest minds were clandestine members. The influence of the Amis was felt throughout the world, although of course most people have never heard of them. Records showed that in 1845, the scientist-explorer Barnabas Drain Sturgeon, a member of the Amis, had acquired extraterrestrial artifacts from the crater at Bimini. Agent's note: for more details on Bimini, please refer to my report last week on the Caribbean meteor strike. Sturgeon shared some of that extraterrestrial material with his associates, Ebhard Bunsen and Gustav Kirchhoff, who had recently set up a facility at the University of Königsberg. At Sturgeon's encouragement, the pair studied the artifacts for almost a year before unlocking the principles of atomic energy. The potential of this breakthrough was clear to Sturgeon and the other members of the Amis. Agent's note: regrettably, the service was not established at this point in history, for if it had been, I am certain that we would have monitored the activities of the Amis more closely. It is likely the enemy agents from the Alliance, Commonwealth, and Imperium had intercepted vastly more of the Amis' correspondence than our own limited network managed to. Tipped off by their spies, the Imperium had Bunsen and Kirchhoff arrested and claimed the material for their Teutonic Knight luminaries to study. This acquisition triggered a series of similar seizures all over the world by agents from the other governments. The Amis were plunged into crisis. Their apolitical nature was under threat, but a solution would present itself from an unexpected source: the expedition south. In the midst of this intellectual upheaval, Barnabas Sturgeon was planning another extraordinary expedition. This time his destination was Antarctica, the vast icebound wilderness at the foot of the world. Theirs was to be a genuine voyage of discovery rather than conquest. The expedition was intended to prove a theory shared by Sturgeon and few other radical scientific minds that the wastes of Antarctica were not empty and desolate. Instead, they concealed treasures of incalculable value. Sturgeon had kept back a particularly curious artifact previously recorded at the Bimini crater, a compass pointing south instead of north. After further tests, along with his closest, the Greek physicist Leonidas Vassiliou, Sturgeon formed the belief that not only was the device pointing to a particular location in the south, but that it was indicating something beneath the surface of Antarctica itself. Following the arrest of Bunsen and Kirchhoff, Sturgeon accelerated his plans, pulling together the resources needed to mount his expedition south. Despite great adversity, he still managed to secure patronage from certain valuable parties, notably Crown Prince Vladimir of the Commonwealth. It was Vladimir who introduced Sturgeon to a scientific polymath of extraordinary talent, Helsinki Markov. At first, he was a priceless asset to Sturgeon's cause, but later he was to become a figure of infamy. A changing environment. The expedition made landfall in Antarctica in 1849, after a long journey fraught with difficulties. However, to the surprise of everyone, not least Sturgeon and his friends, they soon made what appeared to be a finding of great import. A series of reconnaissance flights were undertaken by Miranda Wells and her trustily modified Doncaster, the Eye of Reason. Her patrols inland revealed an extraordinary sight located deep inside the desolate Antarctican interior. A wide, chasm-like trench many miles long and almost a mile wide was revealed. Shimmering, gnarled spires of impossibly polished metal and vast, glowing masses of blue-green crystalline rock spread out like a starfish across the ice. The landscape around the site was different from what had been originally expected. Though most of the landscape was, as anticipated, frozen tundra, there were valleys and mountains that held starkly different climates, flora and fauna. Though Sturgeon had paid handsomely for the service of Maximilian Schneider and his mercenaries to protect the expedition, it remained a journey of great hardship to navigate to this incredible site over land. Along the way, Sturgeon noticed subtle changes to the landscape. These changes were imperceptible at first, but the surrounding valleys of the chasm leading all the way back to their base camp were in a state of comparatively rapid climate change. The permafrost and snow had melted away for the most part, forming lakes or billowing clouds of vapor. Strange megaflora were seen sprouting from these freshly revealed landscapes. Though there were the occasional attacks of large beasts and birds to contend with, the expedition most frequently saw ever more exotic and otherworldly jungle plants and vegetation. Losing more than half of the original expedition along the way, it took over a year to finally reach the trench. When they arrived, what they found was more astonishing than the initial reconnaissance had suggested. Buried amongst the eerie crystalline agglomeration and twisted metal spires sunken into the earth and rock was a strange doorway. Beyond it lay what would truly become a discovery of earth-shaking proportions: the mysterious Antarctic vault. The vault. Once they stepped through the doorway, Sturgeon, Vasilioiu, and their retinue vanished beneath the Antarctic landscape for several days. A series of earth tremors heralded their return, and they were changed profoundly by what they had seen. Agents note, despite several high-ranking members of the Enlightened defecting to the Union, we still have no clear picture of what lies within the vault. I would concur with General Grant's assertion that a military campaign to Antarctica is the most expeditious means of obtaining the secrets of the vault for the Union. More excited and animated than he had ever been, Sturgeon was still as shrewd as he was brilliant. He had observed what had happened to fellow members of the Amis, who revealed their achievement to a greedy world without safeguarding them, so took steps to ensure the vault was not stolen from him. In secret, Sturgeon sent his closest allies instructions to gather resources and materials so that they might expand and fortify their camp around the vault. The facility was dubbed Wells Chasm, after the daring aviator who had braved the hollowing gales above the Antarctic to be the first to spot the crystal and spires. Sturgeon, Marco, Vasilioiu, and the others would embark upon several further journeys into the vault. Inside the inhuman megastructure, virtually everything they found was beyond their ability to comprehend. The excursions were not without their own inherent dangers, as small parties could and would become lost in the vault's labyrinthine corridors and alien architecture. Most painfully for Sturgeon, his closest and most intimate friend, Leonidas, became lost in the vault, never to be seen again. Putting aside his grief, Sturgeon gleaned enough from the artifacts they recovered to set new paths of scientific discovery. Markov estimated that it would take several lifetimes to fully explore and catalog the contents of the vault. At the center of these efforts was the strange superconductive mineral surrounding the vault, and which extended in great vines outwards from it, codified as element 270 and later named Sturgeonium. In honor of Sturgeon himself, the properties of this material would ultimately allow for accelerated exploration of existing fields of scientific undertaking. The mineral would be harvested and shipments sent from Wells Chasm to the original landing site on the Antarctic coast. This harbor camp was itself expanded into a second base of operations for the expedition. Sturgeon named the new harbor facility Leonidas Spire in honor of his late friend. A gift from the stars. By their seventh journey into the vaults, Sturgeon and Markov had enough research gathered to theorize that the vault was the core of some massive alien object which had crashed on Earth centuries ago. There were records from the time that spoke of a ball of fire in the sky and a great earth tremor. Expanding on this hypothesis and reviewing the trajectory from the impact site in Antarctica, Markov noticed an unusual number of meteorite strikes recorded along the flight path. This suggested that the object had begun to break up before it landed. This then pointed to the possibility that any parts of the alien structure's mass that had fallen along the way could also contain element 270. The nature of the impact, erratic trajectory, and calculated size of the object implied a controlled crash guided by some intelligence or pilot. This suggested the object was some kind of colossal ship, perhaps akin to an ocean liner to the stars, themselves only much larger, perhaps a kilometer or more in diameter. If such a craft had impacted with its full force, it would likely have devastated the planet. While it was agreed that the discoveries in the vault were the birthright of humanity, such a wealth of knowledge needed to remain in the hands of few. This custodianship was vital until the explorers had amassed sufficient allies to ensure that no one nation or interest group could pervert this profound discovery for their own petty agenda. The Amis was nothing more than a correspondence group, and with how helpless they had been to save Bunsen and Kirchhoff, something more was needed to safeguard the vault and the new age of science it would unleash. Leaving Markov and several others behind to continue the work, Sturgeon returned to Europe to create the organization he needed. A covenant is agreed. 1852 saw a conclave of the Amis held in the Palazzo del Borremo on Lake Maggiore, Italy. This literal meeting of minds had one purpose: to secure a future for the great undertaking they had agreed on for the betterment of humanity. Freshly returned from his Antarctic expedition, Sturgeon called for a new beginning for the group. No longer would they be a loose collection of correspondents, but instead Sturgeon declared that a more structured and independent movement was needed. This covenant of the Enlightened, as he termed it, would be free from political or patriotic pressures from the nations of the world and would be founded as a theocratic oligarchy. The discoveries of the Enlightened, such as those he had seen in the vault of Antarctica, would be ostensibly for the betterment of humanity, but only when wider humanity could prove itself worthy of these discoveries. Until such time, the Covenant would become custodians of the vault and of the new age of scientific enlightenment that it would herald. Other brilliant minds of the age stepped forward to join with Sturgeon, including the War Master Maximilian Schneider, President Louis Napoleon Bonaparte of the French Republic, the boyar magnate Oleg Tatamovich, the communication specialist Machlon Loomis, the alternate energy prodigies Nikolai Tesla and Augusta Byron, and the engineering authors Hermann Hauput and Gustav Eiffel. This was also the first time that the polymath Burson Carpathian found notice amongst this group as peer and signatory on the Covenant Charter. The conclave became the first symposium of the Enlightened, and it was agreed that each peer of the Enlightened would have an equal status within the Covenant. There were conditions to being granted a place in this new technocracy. To become a lord or lady of the Enlightened, an individual must have their scientific merits recognized by the Covenant. Beyond that, a prospective peer must offer land or some significant holding or power base to serve as the location for their own secure place of learning. Sturgeon offered Well Chasm as a model for the ultimate form of such a facility, what he called the Promethean Complex. Though many peers could not afford to build such a facility, they were content for now to ally themselves with half a dozen lords and ladies who could. Over time, and with the right opportunities taken, each peer would go on to found their own Promethean complex, and by this method, the Enlightened began to develop a decentralized structure and a web of strongholds across the globe, essential if their independence was to be assured. The dawn of a new age. Returning to Wells Chasm with many of the newly dubbed Enlightened, Sturgeon was gratified to see that in his years of absence, Markov had developed Wells Chasm and fortified it with new technologies to ensure that their position on the continent was relatively secure. It was regrettable that a new Eden that surrounded the Promethean complex was already beginning to be despoiled by the industry required for the progress of humanity. A burden of the Covenant was the knowledge that for their destiny to be fulfilled, the world must be forever changed. What use are verdant flora and wondrous fauna if not harnessed for the enlightenment of mankind? Markov, driven by a mixture of exploratory fever and in part by the need to prove the value of their discoveries, had pressed on doggedly and codified the huge amount of the knowledge they found in their exploration of the vault. He firmly believed that time was ripe for the fruits of these labors to be shared with the nations of the earth for the betterment of humanity. For several months, there was a heated discussion amongst the Enlightened as to the correct path. Thanks to Lord Lyon Playfair's cipher, the peers were able to discuss the matters in secret over their Loomis telegraphs. Markov's urging for the sharing of the vault's secrets was mirrored by Carpathian, Afo, Tesla, and the engineering genius Isambard Kingdom Brunel. There was a strong voice of caution, however, from Countess Byron and Lady Drakenberg. They countered that the nations of the world were not yet ready for such power. For years, the Countess had attended the court salons and assemblies of power in Europe and knew how fickle and self-interested governments could be. Drakenberg was aware of a shadowy network moving within similar corridors of power to her own agents who appeared to have loyalty beyond any single nation. The true nature of this dark council she had yet to fathom, but her instincts warned that it did not bode well. Agents note, while our own research on the Dark Council is undoubtedly more comprehensive than the material gleaned by Drakenberg and her spies, there is surely no harm in sourcing a copy of her notes to cross-reference with our own. Our friend, Mr. Modern, may be able to assist us in this matter. Despite these warnings, the Enlightened agreed at a second symposium to dispatch envoys to the major scientific institutions around the world and share without bias their research, confident that as long as no single nation was given preferential treatment or privileged access, they would be secure. Even the Guardist Celestian Empire were receptive to the offer of mutual advancement. In the first few years, this balance and equality stimulated the greatest surge of innovation and invention since the beginning of the Industrial Age. Regular and equal shipments of Elemental 270 were delivered to each nation's principal scientific institution in exchange for a copy of the research, documentation, and prototypes of whatever applications they made with the mineral. The voltaic arc technology that the Imperium had been exploring for years was given a huge boost when Tesla introduced terginium-infused superconductor coils into the design. After seeing what Element 270 could do for their metallurgical research, the Sultanate sent Princess Scheherazade to study at Wells Chasm so that they might embrace this new age of technology fully. Brunel's transportation rotorcraft became a reality for the British Crown as a unique alloy of sturginium and copper created a revolutionary material combining lightweight and incredible strength. The Commonwealth continued to explore sonic applications, now using sturginium-reinforced resonators for breaking apart ice floes, while the French Republic finally made the breakthrough in their attempts to miniaturize their thermal projectors so that the so-called heat lances could be mounted on excavating machines to enable the construction of a vast network of tunnels beneath France and her allies. The Celestian Empire made great strides in the fields of magnetic levitation, and atomic energy through nuclear power eluded them as it continued to confound the Enlightened themselves. Their hubris, of course, meant that the Enlightened retained most of the gathered Element 270 for their own work. It was they who produced the most bleeding-edge application, as the half-dozen newly founded Promethean complexes around the world began work on a series of extraordinary regenerators, each only made possible by the sturginium crystals at their core acting as superconductors. Despite the protestations of Makarov and Carpathian, the Enlightened saw caution in keeping the secrets of these most potent devices away from individual nations. For these were devices that could project thermic shielding screens of energy to defeat projectiles, kinetic enhancers to augment engine efficiency, and machines that could influence local weather patterns. Most incredible of all were bizarre temporal and distance distorters, engines of near super real complexity that could cause localized warps in time or teleport men and material enormous distance in mere moments. The Enlightened arrogantly presumed that no nation should have these marvels, as the applications for warfare were all too obvious and terrifying to them. Agents note, amongst all this ingenuity, no one seemed to notice when Burson Carpathian combined it with Molly Boldakox to create a casket suitable for his own grand scheme to come to fruition. This most unassuming of applications would set in motion events that would change the world far more profoundly than any generator would. Rule of the Custodians. For a while, the Enlightened basked in the glory of their accomplishments, the wave of new technology for which they earned the plaudits they had desired for so long spread out across the world. Sturgeon dared to believe that what he termed the Dystopian Age would herald a new era of peace for all. Across the globe, the development of rudimentary mechanical servants known as automata grew rapidly, from the machines carrying out instructions on simple punch cards to millions of complex instructions being engraved on silver discs so that these mechanical beings could ape more complex reasoning. The eagerness with which other nations absorbed the Enlightened discoveries and the innovations accelerated by Element 270 was matched only by their drive to take these incalculably precious gifts and turn them to warlike ends. Technology designed for weather control, disaster relief, and agricultural resilience became the basis for whole industries of war. The discovery of new metal alloys and chemicals went into the construction of battleships and hulking land ships, cannons, and bombs. The benefits of the Vault revealed once again the true nature of humankind. Each nation was desperate for an advantage over the others and frustrated that their own developments would be shared impartially by the Enlightened. As the nations demanded more, the Enlightened felt compelled to impose rations on Element 270 shipments and demand greater oversight as to its application. Agents note, predictably, the Enlightened would use any pretext to exert undue influence and control over the other global powers. It is a testament to our belief in the Union's manifest destiny that we did not capitulate to such demands. Finally, in 1876, Sturgeon called for the Third Symposium of the Enlightened to propose a solution to the destabilizing nature Element 270 was having on the world. The arguments became heated and splinter factions began to form. Sturgeon used all of his influence and patronage to finally carry the motion on the day. The Enlightened would become true custodians of the knowledge from the Vault, which was now unleashed elsewhere in the world. All the secrets and technologies would be developed exclusively by the Enlightened and withheld from the world at large until they had proven themselves capable of their responsibility for the greater power it contained. There would, doubtless, be some anger and even some military repercussions from the other nations, but as the Enlightened had contained those most terrible of technologies, including the generators for their own arsenal, it would be a brief conflict. The Rebellion of Markov. While Sturgeon was away, Markov had built a political power base as a cover for his true activities. His followers, including Princess Scheherazade of the Sultanate and Burson Carpathian of Romania, believed this custodian ideology was caused through fear and jealousy, in contravention of the goals of the more egalitarian principles of the Enlightened. On this proclamation from the symposium, the authority of the custodians was challenged by a coup instigated by Helsinki Markov. Secretly an agent of the Commonwealth, Markov utilized his allies to set in motion an armed insurrection at Wells Chasm and Leonidas Spire, and fled in the ensuing chaos, taking with him greater generator technology and a large shipment of Element 270 to his patron, Tsar Vladimir. Fighting broke out between the custodians and the egalitarians, resulting in chaos through Promethean complexes around the world. Princess Scheherazade and others took many of the prized secrets of the Covenant back to their homelands. Thanks to Markov's treachery, the world now had access to the most potent weapons and technology the greatest minds on the planet could envisage. The world was set on a path that must surely lead to self-annihilation. Even the powers of the generators were twisted. Weather control devices intended to green the world's deserts were instead used to invoke tempests that devastated towns and villages. Terrifying force projectors were created with the power to make both metals and, more horrifying, flesh run like wax. Interminable minor conflicts continued to flare up around the world, now enlivened by a desire for rivals' powers, technological and scientific secrets, as well as whatever territory and resource it had to offer. For all the scintillating knowledge bestowed by the supposed Sturgeonian Age, basic human nature with its greed and pride, hubris, desire for power, and dominance remained unchanged. But the efforts of the Enlightened could not prevent human ingenuity developing even more dangerous devices from the knowledge they had already unleashed. Pandora's box was well and truly open, and for the Enlightened, even worse was soon to come. Although the revolt quickly subsided when its participants realized the truth, it had already served its purpose for the traitor Markov. In the wake of the revolt and its consequences, the Enlightened left were shaken and shell-shocked. They had believed themselves in their new domain above the petty concerns of nationalistic fervor and factionalism. That conceit, that prideful self-assurance, now lay in ruins. The Schism. By 1857, although the Enlightened had managed to conceal news of the internal crisis from the rest of the world, Markov's treachery ensured that the Covenant was split into two distinct factions. Custodians believed that the advanced technology should be guarded and hidden from the world until humanity reached the maturity to use it, while the egalitarians believed that every man and woman had the right to self-determinism and that it was the obligation of the Enlightened to work with those nations to bring about a new age. The Enlightened's most ardent scientific patron, President Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, had recently founded the Latin Alliance, a bold coalition of France, Spain, and Italy. This emergent power promised to be a safe haven for the scientists and researchers just as the French Republic had been these past 5 years. As a signatory of the Covenant Charter, Bonaparte was obligated to establish a Promethean complex, which he did with the renovation and expansion of Mont Saint-Michel. It was while meeting at Mont Saint-Michel that Juliana Drakenberg discovered that many of the secrets stolen by Markov had made their way onto the black market. Louis Napoleon had purchased as many of these designs outright as he could to keep them out of the hands of rival world powers. As a continued show of good faith with the Covenant, the Latin Alliance shared everything they had acquired and kept out the public domain. Agents note, though as all such technologies had been stolen from the Covenant to begin with, there was little material gain for the Enlightened by this gesture. I'm sure Louis Napoleon was not aware of this fact. In light of the destruction unleashed in the world and the origins of Markov's treachery, the custodians easily amused complete dominance over the shell-shocked Covenant. The most influential peers ensured that those few egalitarians who remained were consigned to the fridges of the organization, effectively exiling them from the Enlightened. Though they were entitled to attend future symposia, any secrets from the vault were denied to them. The hope that was denied the further inventions these ostracized members would wither on the vine. Indeed, they most likely would have, being subsumed into their own national interest over time. Everything would have gone according to the custodians' plans had it not been for the actions of one enlightened peer and a sturgeonium-lined casket. The Hex Seed. Desperately searching for a discovery that might save the life of his ailing wife, Veronica, Burson Carpathian had come into contact with the mysterious Dark Council, individuals who had become bonded with an ancient alien entity known as the Hex. Agents note, what follows contains a significant degree of supposition based on anecdotal accounts. When supported by what the service had witnessed in the field, I cannot help but feel that we are close to the truth of the matter even with a lack of hard evidence. The Hex itself existed in a geode-like seed that was hidden away from the prying eyes of the uninitiated. Carpathian discovered the location and nature of the Hex Seed, and, most interestingly of all, to him, that the base of this alien geode was a huge subterranean reservoir of crimson fluid. The fluid was referred to as the essence of the Hex, but other than helping fuel arcane powers or being ingested to cause physical mutation or transformation, the potential of the fluid was largely untapped. The viscous, crimson liquid was provided to him in small doses and seemed to invigorate his mind when a single drop is imbibed. Tantalized by the invigorating properties of the essence, Carpathian thought that it might hold the secret to returning his wife to health. With the aid of his allies in the Enlightened, Carpathian managed to steal the seed. The Dark Council had agents throughout Europe, and Carpathian reasoned that it would not be long before he was identified as the architect of the theft. Nowhere in Europe would be safe for the experimentation he intended, but two of the Enlightened here in the Union of Federated States had offered him sanctuary. Gustav Eiffel and the brilliant geologist Pretrena Gage had been forced into exile thanks to their support of Makrov's insurrection. They had secured the town of Payson in the Arizona territory as an ideal home for Carpathian and his work. Crossing the Atlantic on the steamer Lady B, Carpathian, his wife Veronica, and their allies were aware that their prospective foster nation was racked with tensions as the northern and southern states vied for control of the vast resources of the continent. They hoped to arrive unnoticed. They could not have been more wrong. Agents note, here we must again make an educated guess based on the available facts. As you know, the very existence of the Dark Council is difficult to verify, let alone to what extent, if any, it has influence here in Washington, D.C. What follows in regard to General Grant is taken from information supplied in confidence by our friend Garrett Modern. Though his candor is appreciated, I feel it unlikely to be welcomed by General Grant should you share any of the following with him. The Dark Council undoubtedly would have found itself severely weakened by Carpathian's actions. Clearly, it was still more than capable of exerting its influence and exacting revenge. Carpathian had been marked for death. Using what resources and connections it had, the Dark Council manipulated Odysseus Grant, who was at this time a promising army captain, now reputed to have fallen to drink and paranoia, fueled by rumors of fresh European threat to the security of the Union. Grant was set on a course to destroy Carpathian and his newly arrived Enlightened entourage. Taking the travelers completely by surprise, Grant's bombardment killed most of the Enlightened landing party, and Carpathian was smashed like a ragdoll against the seed-carrying casket he had risked so much to bring to these shores. Twisted and broken as consciousness left him, Carpathian saw his wife Veronica dead at his side, her body pierced by a single bullet that had gone unnoticed in the cacophony of battle. A new beginning. Carpathian awoke days later atop the casket containing the hex seed. He had been carried many miles away from the carnage, but he barely heard or cared. His wife was dead, and he was delirious with pain. With consciousness came the realization that both his arms and legs were shattered, and he sensed the onset of infection. Death would surely claim him before long. The Enlightened made their careful way to Payson, where others of the Covenant were waiting for them. The eccentric Dr. Francis Tumblety immediately took charge of the barely alive Carpathian and began to work on him. As he recovered, Carpathian put aside the pain and despair of his wife's death and focused instead on the future. If Veronica could not be healed, then perhaps she could be resurrected? That's an idea. He would need to make war against death itself to achieve this vision. Eiffel and another peer in exile, Emily Roebling, had foreseen the renovation and fortifications of Payson. The town had become a Promethean complex built on the example of Wells Chasm. Carpathian dubbed his new home the War Cradle. The entire town had been completely rebuilt to their specifications, combining classic European architecture with the rough and ready materials of the American West. It contained extensive laboratory and meeting spaces, not to mention formidable defenses that would make the town a veritable fortress should it come under attack. Most important of all were the catacombs excavated beneath the War Cradle, the deepest of which would serve as a vault to securely store the stolen seed. Carpathian dismissed the workers who had helped him before collapsing the passageways that had led them down. An alternative route known only to himself led him back out in the hot, dry air of Payson. As impressive as all this was for the nigh impossible feat he aimed to achieve, Carpathian knew that he would need resources and a power base in the Union many times larger than he could currently call on. Now his work truly began. The invention of RJ-1027. With the hex seed now shielded securely beneath the War Cradle, Carpathian devoted all his time and resources to experimentation with the essence. He exposed biological matter to the alien mineral and worked to create more of the volatile crimson fluid. Tantalizingly, he discovered that by mixing the fluid with gunpowder or other accelerants, he could greatly increase the potency of weaponry and combustion engines, a process colloquially known as juicing them. Once he had stockpiled a sufficient quantity and designed suitable armored and durable sturgeonium-enhanced containers for it, he announced the 4th Enlightened Symposium to be held in Payson at the War Cradle. The date of this symposium, the 27th of October 1859, had special significance for Carpathian, as it was also the date of his wedding anniversary. As he stared into the glowing crimson fluid, he felt a connection to his wife as well as the promise of her eventual resurrection. In the wider world, their authority challenged by the announcement, the custodians leaning Enlightened were in a difficult position. Fearing a future division, Sturgeon and his allies at Wells Chasm acknowledged his 4th symposium, but claimed security concerns in the rapidly destabilizing Union for a reason not to attend in person. Many Enlightened did attend, however, including Princess Scheherazade and distinguished guests such as Amaninte Dupin, Giuseppe Garibaldi, and Louis Jules Torchet. To them, Carpathian unveiled his greatest invention, a new wonder fuel he called RJ-1027. Agent's note: presumably, Carpathian believes that the pseudoscience of the name would hopefully distance the liquid from its true origins to the general public as well as to his peers. Though the service is fully aware of the true nature of RJ-1027, I understand the need for such facts to remain within the service at this time. For the Enlightened, RJ-1027 represented a near-infinite power source limited in application only by their imaginations. That it had been developed and designed by Bursan Carpathian, the self-proclaimed father of the Enlightened, was undisputed. Available for all the world to use, RJ-1027 rapidly became the means by which the designs of much of the new wave of technology unleashed by the Enlightened became possible. Sturgeon reluctantly contacted Carpathian via Loomis telegraph to offer his congratulations, and Carpathian graciously gifted Will's Chasm with the first shipment of RJ-1027 canisters so that their important work in the vault might benefit. Although some of the Enlightened like Nikola Tesla and Augusta Byron still favored power sources they had independently developed within 5 years, the Enlightened were almost exclusively powering their advanced technologies with RJ. The energy contained in an oil drum-seized RJ cylinder could power a family home for 6 months before it would need to be switched for a new one. The spent RJ cylinders would be collected and taken back to the war cradle where they would be recharged for a small fee. Within a decade, 1 million canisters of RJ-1027 of all different sizes would be found in transit back to the war cradle at any one time. A whole third of the immense factory city turned over to the safe storage and reprocessing of canisters. Civil War. The sale and supply of RJ-1027 was only the first step in Carpathian's plan. The cost of processing and generating more of the essence with the secrecy that required was relatively high. The vast majority of the world's fuel requirements were still driven by coal, oil, timber, and gas. This was unlikely to change for the next few decades as the application of RJ-1027 tended to be for more advanced technologies rather than day-to-day. Carpathian needed something to drive the purchase and distribution of the technologies. Agents note, the Union did not disappoint in this matter. The initial flashpoint in 1861 was over the extensive oil and mineral reserves of the Mississippi and Texas. Carpathian and the Enlightened loyal to him knew that the power they required for their great work could only be acquired if these tensions and fears were stoked. Carpathian and his Enlightened needed to be in a position to demand autonomy and favor from whichever faction came out on top. To that end, they began to sell juice rifles, automata, sonic cannons, and of course, the wonder fuel that allowed all these infernal devices to be powered to both sides. Thus, when the Civil War erupted in earnest, it was fought with the most destructive weapons ever devised by man. Armies were swept from the fields as streams of crimson power flashed beneath the rising clouds of smoke and dust. Armored land ships crawled across the churned muddy ground, shrugging off blasts that would have shattered castles. Millions died and the nation was devastated as the war dragged on. The Confederacy and the Union equally matched throughout the availability of enlightened technology. As year after bloody year passed with no sign of an eventual winner, enlightened elsewhere in the world began to fear that would never end. They predicted with certainty that the country would be reduced to a smoldering cinder before the war reached a conclusion. Eventually, it was Nikola Tesla who broke faith with the rest of the Enlightened and intervened, despite Sturgeon and the other peers warning him not to. Taking his voltaic technologies with him, Tesla journeyed to the Union, providing them with what would turn out to be the upper hand. Supported by Tesla coil-powered automata and devastating rolling thunder tanks, the war ended within months. The exhausted populace on both sides of the Manson-Dixon line finally brokered an uneasy peace. Agents note, Director Lincoln, have you ever asked Nikolai why he chose the North over the South? Carpathian was furious, watching all of the groundwork he had laid with the Confederacy rendered useless with their defeat. He immediately moved to consolidate his holdings through the connections and alliances he had built with Northern interests. The foundations of several Promethean complexes had been established during the war, and now these were greatly expanded and reinforced into massive industrial cities on the land ceded to them by the newly victorious Union. Enlightenment of the Self. Knowing better than any other what the true purpose of the Enlightened was, Carpathian directed his servants and acolytes at the war cradle, making it the most advanced source of weapons and research in the world. The aloof Sturgeon and his allies at Will's Chasm saw the emergence of Carpathian and those who followed him as a dangerous, unstable element within the Enlightened. The Union Civil War had been a flashpoint, driving on scientific endeavors around the globe as well as the demand for RJ-1027 and the technologies that it could power. But the conflict had also breathed new life into the egalitarian movement within the Covenant. Now the notions of Carpathian became a credible alternative to the principles espoused by Sturgeon. Following the betrayal of Markov, the facilities in the Antarctic have been expanded, with a large shipyard and airfield producing all manner of advanced craft to help the Enlightened project their principles across the globe. while Carpathian and his allies have chosen to portion out advanced technologies equally and fan the flames of industry and conflict, so too have Sturgeon and the rest of the Enlightened taken whatever steps they deem necessary against those same nations to ensure that no power gains a decisive advantage. Sturgeon is lord of Welf's Chasm, now a bustling metropolis built around the fabled vault itself, and Leonidas Spire, the great port on the Antarctican peninsula, presided over by Maximilian Schneider. From these two Promethean complexes spread a vast network of tunnels cut and blasted by engineers with drills, ice burners, and the tireless TX-01 automata. Underground galleries contain workshops and farms illuminated by sun-like globes, made habitable by atmospheric controls interconnected by rails and pneumatic pressure tubes. Elsewhere in the world, though not quite to the scale of the Union Civil War, other opportunities have enabled Promethean complexes to be established. Through such agreements, the Enlightened are usually left alone by their host governments, although their methods and attitudes often make for tense relationships with the local populace. The Promethean complex known as the Gateway was once the tiny South Atlantic island of South Georgia. This island city is quite literally the entrance to the Antarctic approach through which all visitors must pass. The Crown is resentful of being manipulated to sell the land to the Enlightened. Agents note, the Crown may be resentful, but I think it's fair to say that now that our dependence on the Enlightened has faded, we are in open aggression here in the Union, particularly against our guests out in the Badlands. Even the general populace now sees Carpathian and his peers for what they truly are, opportunistic monsters making coats for themselves out of the widow's weeds. I understand that this mounting antagonism towards the Enlightened has caused Nikolai and his assistants to go to great lengths to distinguish themselves from their Enlightened cousins. Having witnessed the pipeworks myself, it is clear that beyond the publicly accessible lobby and conference rooms, the facility is still, to all intents and purposes, a Promethean complex. An Enlightened present. The Enlightened are vastly changed since their founding a quarter of a century ago. Now, more self-focused and fractured than before, they are still collectively driven by the ultimate goal of elevating humanity through science. Hulking monstrosities guard the entrances to their labyrinthian Promethean complexes that are dotted around the globe. Overhead, their bizarre and wondrous rotorcraft ferry materials back and forth between these strongholds. It is folly to mistake their unusual appearance for weakness, as they are bristling with concealed rockets and searing lasers ready to annihilate any who would threaten them. Similarly, their fleet is usually hidden from view beneath the waves, elegantly rising only when needed to loose weaponry that cleaves through the enemy armor and shields. The Enlightened make a prodigious use of their vaulted generator technology, confounding their foes or harry them from new and unexpected quarters. Thanks to the actions of the traitor Markov, the clash of nations, and the influence of the Hex, the Enlightened's plan to control the world through science and technology has come to naught, and the various groups and factions are left scrambling to follow the many counter-agendas they have devised. Though the Covenant of the Enlightened still arrogantly places itself above the petty jingoism of the nations of the earth, rivalries between the Enlightened members are fierce. Competing designs are often produced in different Promethean complexes in an attempt to earn their inventor prestige amongst their fellow peers, or lucrative contracts should they feel that selling their creations will further their goal. An example of this conflict was seen when Zerach Colburn's Black Hoof Automata was replaced as the primary means of personal transport in the Union Army by Erasmus Levitt's Iron Horse. The sickness and death caused by the automata's primitive atomic batteries resulted in such humiliation for Colburn that he flung himself from the cooling tower of his Promethean complex, the Iron Citadel. Within the Promethean complex, each peer rules as a technological autocrat and is responsible for maintaining a militia or retinue armed with the latest in Enlightenment advancements. Some peers make use of extensive mechanical augmentation to create a capable force out of the physically injured or idealistic volunteers. Others have explored the paths of automation to create marvelous machines capable of a semblance of independent thought processing. Able to carry out varying of tasks with the world's most advanced fleet of naval ships, the armored machines and aircraft the Enlightened continue to push envelope of human advancement, harnessing any technologies they can create or reverse engineering. Beyond the predominant ideologies within the Enlightened of egalitarianism and custodianship, the relationship is more nuanced, and each peer pursues the agenda of the Covenant in their own way. Isambard, Kingdom Brunel, expands his time at the vast workhouse complex known as Belcheli, designing ever more impressive engineering feats for his patron, Queen Victoria. Bruno is convinced that the world was at peace when the crown's rule was unchallenged, and now puts his great intelligence to work considering how best to return the crown to her former glory. For Barnabas Sturgeon at Wells Chasm, it is about developing the secrets of the vault and dealing with those who would misuse them. For Lady Juliana Drakenberg at the Gateway, it is about keeping an eye on the scientific achievements of the 7 great power blocks and eliminating or seizing emerging technologies that would prove a danger to the world. Through these peers and dozens more, the dreams of the Sturgeonian Age had faded into the reality of the Dystopian Age. It is only a matter of time before the brilliant minds of the Covenant of the Enlightened are called upon to defend humanity in their darkest hour. Until then, they must each learn to find a place in this era of constant warfare and strife that they themselves have created.